address this plenary session of this 13th meeting of high-ranking officials responsible for security matters, and shared the views of our ministry regarding the work we need to do in the world today, in keeping with the orders of the President of the Russian Federation and in line with his view of the situation. It is a glad sign that your forum, which has become traditional and which evokes lively interest across the world, including those countries which are not represented here, I must say, and those might be even more interested in its proceedings than others, because this forum reflects a historic tradition of countries of the global majority gaining extra understanding of the need to stand up for their rights and their lawful place in international relations. In this room, we see representatives of many countries of the global south and global east. The voice of these countries is heard loud and clear when the issues of the world today are discussed. And this reflects the tectonic shifts that have occurred in international politics and is still happening these years. And these are the rapid formation of a multipolar world structure, a redistribution of the balance of forces towards new centers of development in the Eurasian continent, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These realities of the day are now recognized in the West, but instead of taking these new realities into account, America, and especially Europe, has a lot of figures who believe that multipolarity is not a fact, but a challenge to their rules-based economic order that the West is trying to impose on the world and has been trying since the end of World War II, acting in their interests. The international community is forced to accept the opinion that international order is an all-out fight of all against all. We can't agree with that. This does not reflect the true global situation. We don't believe that this is a true picture of the world. The West insists that confrontation and conflict of great powers is inevitable. This is something that life has proven not to be true. Take the relations between Russia and the People's Republic of China, the two great neighbors. These relations developed dynamically, and the leaders of China and the Russian Federation agree that these relations are in the best possible shape, the best they have ever been in history. And in their quality, they are a much more advanced form of interaction than the classical unions of the past. Another example is the privileged strategic partnership between Russia and yet another great civilization of Eurasia, which is India. The respectful, mutually beneficial, trusting relations that are typical of the relations between my country and BRICS member states and dozens of countries that cooperate with BRICS, and these are countries of the global south and the global east, demonstrate that constructive interaction between large players on the international arena representing different continents, religions, and affiliations is now one of the pillars of the multipolar world, advancing the interests of the global majority on the international arena. The multipolar world formation is international law and good neighborliness, respect for the rights and interests of the neighbors. The stability of the global system will largely depend upon whether or not we can make the West stop putting forward their non-legal interests and stay true to the UN Charter and the principles embodied in it. They should respect those interests in full, not selectively, as Europe and America often do, believing that they can do what they want. The founding fathers of the United Nations organizations have had the insight of opening that international organization, founding it on, quote, sovereign equality of states, unquote. This principle guarantees the respect for lawful rights and interests of any country, independently of its size, population size, or other parameters. If we look at the history of conflicts in the world after the formation of the United Nations organization, we must say that there is not one single conflict of this kind where the West would have stuck to the principle of sovereign equality of states. You may revise the history of global conflicts over the past 80 years to prove me right. This position of the West has repeatedly caused crises in international relations. The selective approach to the application of the UN Charter was especially demonstrated in the case of Ukraine. We believe it is unacceptable to insist on the principle of territorial integrity that the West has and which is supported by the Secretariat of the United Nations Organization and other international organizations, while they forget the principle of self-determination of nations. And it's the principle of self-determination of nations that is the legal foundation of the process of decolonization, the process that brought freedom to a large number of the African continent and other regions of the world. The international community long gave a full response to the seeming legal collision between the principles of self-determination and territorial integrity. After many years of negotiations, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Principles of International Law, which is a consensus document, and that document states quite clearly it is necessary to respect the territorial integrity of all states whose governments do not violate the principle of self-determination of peoples and thus represent fully the population of their territory. We must ask ourselves, does that apply to the Kiev regime that unleashed a war against its own population after the coup d'etat of 2014? Did it represent the population of the southeast of Ukraine? No, definitely not. Just as in the 1960s, the colonizers in Paris, London, Lisbon, Berlin, Brussels could not represent the interests of the peoples of Africa that wanted to live under the governments elected by their people and not imposed from the outside. The same happened again after the coup d'etat across the territories of Ukraine, the former Soviet Republic. The Nazi regime that came to power after that coup for many years has been violating the rights of Russian and Russian-speaking population, and recently, starting from the 2010s, it started legally to exterminate the Russian world and everything connected with it and with Russia. The use of the Russian language, Russian-speaking media, and more. All of that is banned. Last year, they adopted a law to ban the canonical Russian Orthodox Church, which is a cruel violation of one more fundamental principle of Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations, which states that all states must ensure human rights despite the people's race, gender, language, and religion. The West uses every opportunity when dealing with countries represented in this room, likes to lecture others about human rights and honoring them in their own Western understanding. But look what happened recently, especially after the coup in Ukraine. Never have they used the phrase human rights. Not at all. Ursula von der Leyen and other Brussels bureaucrats and also the NATO leadership have stated publicly more than once that they must support Ukraine because it, quote, defends European values, unquote. So these must be the values, exterminating a national identity of the Russian or Russian-speaking people in that country. Just imagine, not even in the Middle East or in Israel do they forbid the use of Arabic, the Arabic language. Palestine does not ban the use of Hebrew. And the same happens anywhere else in the world where people speaking different nations coexist, even if those peoples are not each other's best friends. Recently, Ms. Kos, a UN commissioner for extension or something or other, claimed that Ukraine had completed all the preconditions for starting the process of integration into the European Union. How does that match the European values which they profess? In fact, it is the demonstration of Nazi principles fully. On the initiative of President Trump and with the support of the President of Turkey and the leaders of Saudi Arabia, we have launched direct contacts with the leadership of Ukraine. On the 16th of May this year, Istanbul saw a resumption of negotiations. For a long time, Ukraine refused to participate. It was told not to become involved in that by their puppet masters, especially from Europe. When in Istanbul these negotiations resumed, we insisted that the principles that we profess be honored there, and we will keep insisting on that in the next round of these negotiations, which will be announced very soon. Russia has always, before the special military operation ever started and since its beginning, we have proposed to the Ukraine to settle all the issues by diplomatic means and dialogue. And we must thank the governments that have been of service to help restart these negotiations without any preconditions. In order to achieve success, we're firmly convinced it's necessary to eliminate the root causes of military conflict, which is something that the President of Russia has said time and again. One of those root causes is just what I mentioned, denying the millions of Ukrainians the right to use their mother tongue, Russian, and to honor the memory of their ancestors who had lived in that territory for hundreds of years, building cities and ports and tilling the land. And now these people are living in such conditions where in the south and east of Ukraine they see historical monuments pulled down, monuments to Russian czars and war heroes, the monuments erected to those who helped rid the world of German fascism in World War II. But there are more reasons than just that. And this is to do with the policy of pulling Ukraine into the structure of NATO. I have stated many times that a trigger to the Ukrainian conflict and in fact to the profound crisis of European security has been the many years of eastward expansion of NATO. Something that happened in contrast to the promises of Europeans and Americans given to Russia that NATO will not expand to the east. And not just these promises orally given that were violated. In fact, this was a violation of commitments signed on the highest possible level during the 1999 Istanbul and 2010 Astana agreements, which stated that security is to be indivisible and common, and that no country or group of countries can attempt to dominate across the territory of OSCE. And this is precisely what NATO was doing. When we tried to confront our European colleagues with that, telling them that they were violating something that their leaders had signed, the response was, oh, it was just a political declaration, and legal rights will only be given to those countries that apply for NATO membership, which proves that that position was a lie to begin with. And certainly Russia had to respond to that, to act against it. As President Putin said many times, we have tried to shift the situation into the negotiation mode to stay true to those principles signed, but the West refused. Even in 2021, this last attempt was refuted, and we had no other means to uphold the rightful interests of the people whom we could not abandon to the Nazi regime in Ukraine than to do what we did. As to NATO membership, a neutral non-bloc member and non-nuclear Ukraine was part of the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine signed and adopted in 1991. It was the declaration of such a neutral and unaligned status of Ukraine made it possible to have Ukraine recognized as an independent state by Russia and other members of the international community. And this promise, this oath made by Ukraine that the Nazi regime has vowed to break, and included that intention into its constitution. So the annulment of this position is one of the demands that Russia makes upon Ukraine, as was stated in Istanbul in 2022, when this principle was laid down on paper, but those negotiations were undermined by the Ukrainian side and its puppet masters. And they are not trying to learn any lessons from this. We observe NATO or Western continents growing along all of the front line, and this line has now grown longer. It now includes Sweden and Finland. And we hear the voices of irresponsible European politicians who urge the population of Europe to tighten their belts and prepare for war with Russia, war against Russia, giving the dates of 2030 or others. Mr. Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, has promised to once again turn Germany into a leading European power. This rang something to many observers. Twice did Germany become the leading European power in the 20th century, and look what horrors it brought to the peoples, not just of Europe.
This is not enough for the European strategists. Now the NATO makes steps in order to go beyond its responsibility area and to moves to the Asia-Pacific region that they now call the Indian Pacific region, and they threaten to undermine the security architecture that for many decades has cropped out around the ASEAN and helped the countries of the region and their partners from different countries of the world to successfully cooperate. And this certainly causes a lot of concern. We're concerned about the future of ASEAN and the future of those countries when NATO. Once we asked them, the former Secretary General of NATO was asked, how comes that you have such plans in Asia-Pacific region? Because assumingly NATO, this is a defensive alliance that is supposed to protect the territory of its member states. And Stoltenberg, ex-Secretary General, was not shy to say that, yes, we still are protecting the territory of the member countries. But now the threat to those territories emanates from the Indo-Pacific region, from South China Sea, from the Taiwan Strait, from Southeast Asia. And you see how the elements of military infrastructure are being set up there. Washington and Seoul altogether plan to arrange certain drills, including the nuclear components. Groups of 3 or groups of 4 are being set up, such as South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, Australia. Attempts are made to replicate the example of AUKUS, to embrace other configurations of a closed nature bloc type associations, and they blatantly try to make some countries from the ASEAN alliance withdraw from that organization and integrate them into their military blocs. Certainly we are ready to show support to our ASEAN friends in standing up for the architecture that was confirmed within the different summits. The historical experience shows that if NATO comes to you, then you have to wait for horror, and former Yugoslavia remembers that, along with Libya and other countries. A special concern is caused by the situation in the Middle East. The strategically important region is on the verge of complete destabilization, largely as a result of long-term destructive policies of Westerners. And we believe it is not too late to take urgent measures to de-escalate the situation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict zone and to intensify efforts to create conditions for the early resumption of the negotiation process on all final status issues in order to fix the historical injustices that prevented us from setting up an independent Palestinian state on the basis of the United Nations resolution. Also, an alarming situation has once again developed around the Iranian nuclear program by destroying the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Such a decision was taken by the United States 8 years ago, and certain circles in the United States and in the West expected to put an end to Tehran's civilian nuclear developments, disregarding its legitimate rights under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And now we see negotiations being held between the United States and Iran, where the peaceful use of nuclear is a key one, and judging by the comments shared by the parties following another round of negotiations, there is a hope that finally some progress would be achieved and that we are moving in the right direction, and we wish every success to such efforts, hoping that the results would be achieved and the results would be satisfying for all the interested parties, including Iran. In his address to our August meeting, President Putin noted the meaning of that year, once we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany and Japanese militarism, and setting up the modern world order with the United Nations playing the pivotal role. We stand up for setting up for a global security infrastructure in the modern conditions that would rest on the modern tendencies of multipolar nature, emergence of new centers of gravity that would guarantee the necessary conditions for peaceful development for all the countries. And let me remind you that we have the foundation for that. So that's the United Nations Charter. But it only takes everyone to comply with that. An important step on that way to set up the global security architecture is about building the equitable and indivisible security architecture in Eurasia, the vastest one, and its stability certainly would determine the sustainability of the whole world. At the same time, we don't have a regional organization for that, unlike Africa, which has an African Union, or unlike CELAC in Latin America. So President Vladimir Putin has put forward the initiative of creating an architecture of such a security system in Eurasia, and we invite all the countries and alliances of the continent to join our efforts, including the countries from the western part of Eurasia. In our opinion, it has to be a Eurasian architecture, because Euro-Atlantic concepts that were tried for the European part of the continent over the last decades after the end of the World War II and during the Cold War, those Euro-Atlantic concepts discredited themselves. The NATO would violate all possible commitments. The OSCE turned out to be absolutely dysfunctional as far as the Western countries. And the Secretariat of the OSCE abandoned the commitments enshrined in the founding documents, including the consensus principle and the unbiased nature of decision-making. And a couple of years ago, an agreement was signed with NATO, and this way, actually, it joined the Euro-Atlantic schemes. Russia proceeds from the fact that in Eurasia, we see the nascence of what President Putin called the Greater Eurasian Partnership, and it certainly facilitates the integratory processes that are taking place within the Eurasian Economic Union, ASEAN, in the framework of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And it is associated with other sub-regional structures that exist in the Gulf region and in South Asian Peninsula. There are lots of sub-regional organizations there, and certainly harmonizing and streamlining of those integration processes will help us to build a solid foundation for providing the security architecture. Russia is not imposing anything on anyone, and we're ready for a mutual respectful dialogue with everyone. And so we'll improve the existing security mechanisms, and we'll use that in our work. For instance, within the CSTO, the CIS, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we are promoting within our bilateral ties with the partners and allies new principles that would contribute to setting up the Eurasian security architecture. Let me mention the recently signed treaties on the security guarantee initiative between Russia and Belarus, Russia and Turkey, and Russia and Iran on comprehensive strategic partnership. And certainly, I'd like to highlight especially that all these steps and all these initiatives echo the global security initiative proposed by Chinese President Xi, including the most important provision that the key to resolution of any conflicts anywhere in the world is identifying and eliminating the root causes of such conflicts. Next step would be about preparing the Eurasian Charter of Diversity and Multipolarity in the 21st century. The document was proposed by Belarus, and we support it. It is seeking to set up the political and legal foundations of interaction between states in the sphere of security in the Eurasian space and the parameters of cooperation between countries in a multipolar world, proceeding from the United Nations Charter in its entirety. Colleagues, Russia certainly seeks to make its own contribution to resolving the problems common for the whole mankind. And certainly, over the last years, Russia played a pivotal role in promoting our work in the area of ICT. As the very first step, we, last December, made sure that the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Convention Against Cybercrime, the very first universal treaty in the field of cybercrime. It was Russia's initiative, and we call on all the countries to join that document. And this autumn, this document would be signed in the capital of Vietnam. We're convinced that the United Nations still can build up its efforts on agreeing the universal principles and criteria in other areas as well, including artificial intelligence and where it might be used. And you know that certainly there are heated discussions around that. We do believe that this topic has to be considered by the global group of experts who, and also let me mention a few words about the problem of terrorism that was mentioned in the movie and in the address by the President Putin. Certainly, we are interested in strengthening the cooperation with everyone who is not making difference between good and bad terrorists and who is not using double standards. Let me draw your attention to the terrorism done by Kiev regime, and you know that they are behind the killings of Russian journalists, politicians, public figures. This is the regime that openly states its plans to continue massive shelling of the civilian facilities and killing the civilian population of the Russian Federation. This is deplorable that in the West they react only to our fear and just reciprocal acts against Actually, the Kiev acts of terror, and let me note that Kiev is shelling the civilian facilities and the civilians, whereas Russia reciprocates by striking the military facilities only. We'll make sure that everyone understands the very essence of what is going on, and that in another attempt to make excuses for the Kiev regime and its involvement in the acts of terror, and that these attempts are disclosed. And certainly, we will certainly support peace, strategic stability, and we will contribute to the resolution of conflicts, and we will promote the reconciliating agenda. I wish every success and fruitful work to your meeting, and every success in your responsible work. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Lavrov, and so that I'm passing the floor to Sergei Naryshkin, Director of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. Your Excellency, Mr. Shoigu, Mr. Lavrov, Mr. Shiglov, and ladies and gentlemen, in front of our eyes, the world is undergoing a deep geopolitical transformation. Step by step, a multipolar world is coming into the shape. New centers of gravity are rising that represent the interests of the global majority. More and more countries and peoples are making the choice in favor of really free and sovereign development, thus denying liberal dogmas and relying on the traditional values. This year, we celebrate the 80th anniversary of the end of the World War II. The decisive defeat of Nazi Germany and militarist Japan symbolized the defeat of Nazi ideology, the demise of and the failure of its leaders to enslave the people, to deprive them of their identity and destroy them end of day. The collective security architecture that emanated by the end of the war guaranteed for the respect for sovereignty, non-interference into other countries' affairs, the right of countries and nations to independently choose their own way of political, public, and economic development. Unfortunately, the lessons of history were not learned by everyone. Today's hegemonic attempts by the West to change in their favor the balance of forces again threaten the global and regional security. The rehabilitation of Nazism and Nazi collaborationism has become a precursor of what the Kiev regime did in order to exterminate the Russian-speaking population in the southeast part of Ukraine, and it triggered the protruded Ukrainian crisis. What is the root cause of that strategy, the deadly one? In my opinion, the matter is the colonial thinking which is habitual for the West, the habit to divide the mankind into two unequal parts, privileged minority and the oppressed majority.
The former believe they are denizens of the so-called blossoming garden. The others are supposed to play the role of the nutrients of this so-called garden, which actually is a hotbed of racism and violence. In retrospect, the history of international relations shows that the source of all of the major military conflicts of the past 300 years was a very narrow group of pretty much the same Western European states. Starting from the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, which for the first time in history was fought on five continents at the same time, and ending with World War II. We're observing the same trends. A predatory instinct of Western metropolis turn into conflicts which wreak havoc and claim human lives, both in Europe and thousands of kilometers away from it. The criminal Hitler doctrine of Lebensraum, freeing up living space, was denounced at the Nuremberg trials, but that was a continuation of that colonial policy and logic. The only difference was that it was very provocative, very blunt, and reached the apogee of hatred. Therefore, the fall of Germany and militarist Japan and the dismantling of the system of colonialism were so closely intertwined. Fighting neo-colonial developments is pretty much still a priority of Russia's foreign policy. A major component of this struggle is strengthening multilateral integration formats where cooperation is based on the principles of equality, mutual respect, and non-interference in each other's affairs. In Eurasia, what we de facto have is a wide alliance including Russia, its partners and allies in the CIS, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the emerging Greater Eurasian Partnership. There's a lot of potential in terms of giving birth to a just and democratic architecture of international relations lies within BRICS, especially given its current expanded format. Western mass media love calling BRICS the alternative to the Group of Seven. However, unlike the G7, BRICS is a union of equal states which are looking for answers to the emerging challenges together. The aforementioned international formats, such as the African Union or the CELAC in Latin America, are the foundation of a multipolar world which is coming to replace deliberately this unipolar globalization. The West could play an important role in the emerging world order if it stopped in its racist attempts to force its own rules of the game on others. There are some early signs of awakening among Western elites to this new geopolitical reality, but these signs remain few and far between. In particular, we see the pushback from the so-called deep state that was caused by President Trump's plans to roll back the global propaganda of transhumanism and liberal democracy in order to focus on really pressing concerns of American politics and economy. Similarly fierce is the pushback against Mr. Trump's desire to end the conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East. There's a lot of infighting in the United States, which is extremely fierce, exemplified by numerous assassination attempts on Mr. Trump. In Europe, this resistance against the wind of multipolarity is even more evident because the ruling elites in Europe are used to living under American protectorate and protection and seem to be incapable of strategic thinking anymore. The leadership of the EU and the leading European powers unfortunately continues to act in the neo-colonial logic of inertia. Case in point here is the crisis in Ukraine. Europe seems set in its tracks to use Ukraine as a ram against Russia while also rearming itself. European citizens are being told that there's a need for weaponization and they're being intimidated by the so-called threat from the East. A similar logic was used by Hitler, by the way, in the run-up to World War II. The danger of this course to the whole continent is fully appreciated by clear-thinking, reasonable politicians in Europe whose voices are becoming louder, but they are facing increasing repression from the so-called liberal, but in essence, totalitarian democracy. This is exemplified in part by the crisis around presidential elections in Romania, by persecutions of political opponents in France, and the persecutions of the Alternative for Germany in Germany. Dear colleagues, today, as the very foundations of the global order are being shaken and the pillars of security are trembling, Russia, together with its friends and allies, once again is assuming the burden of leadership and is playing an active role in finding and looking for solutions to global crises. Let me add one thing. Historically, our country has always advocated for a just world order. That was the case when the Vienna system of international relations was created in the first quarter of the 19th century, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And that was also the case during the bipolar moment established after World War II. Both those systems, the Vienna system and the Yalta-Potsdam system, were characterized by stability, resilience, and reliability. They ensured lengthy periods of stability and calm for humanity. On the contrary, the Versailles world order created after World War I, which excluded the participation of Russia, as well as the bipolar world which emerged after the breakup of the Soviet Union, turned out to be unjust, fragile, and untenable. The obvious conclusion is as follows. Russia has no right to be weak. Russia can't afford it. Russia can't afford rolling back its own, giving up on its own values, chasing the chimeras of globalism and liberal totalitarianism. History tells us that Russia's firm footing is necessary for security in Eurasia and in the whole world, ultimately. This resilience and strength requires a good, equitable relations with Russia's neighbors in Eurasia and like-minded groups around the world. I am confident that we can work together to find solutions to the most complex global issues. And the meeting that we are hosting today with your participation, colleagues, is a great contribution. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Mr. Naryshkin. And now I'd like to give the floor